welcome to Inside the Recording Studio. I am Jody Whitesides, and with me is Mr. Chris Hellstrom.
How you doing, Jody?
I'm doing alive and not unwell. How about you?
I'm about the same.
You're about the same.
Yes. I'm not unwell, and I think I'm alive, so things are all looking up.
This is good. This is good.
Yes.
This is good.
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what's been going on in your week?
Lots of new things. One of them's Luna.
Yes.
Luna is now here amongst us.
Yeah. So we're dating this episode a little bit.
Yes, just a little.
Yeah.
But who cares?
Yeah, right? By the time of taping,
Luna
is
has
out.
already out. Yes, that is correct.
And you've had some interesting observations, right?
I have, but they will
Should we
probably
touch on that, or
maybe
no?
we should save that for another episode because we're not really talking about DAWs today, per
No,
se.
we're not. What are we talking about?
I believe we're talking about mixing lead vocals, and it's a two-part series. So that today is part 1. Next week is part 2.
Yes, that's the idea.
That's the
some
idea.
different techniques and tips here to how one might approach mix. And we should probably preface by saying that we're talking about lead vocals.
Yeah, lead
today.
vocals. We're not talking backgrounds.
Right, not today anyway.
No.
Yeah, so actually, let's just dive right in, shall we?
I'm going head first, right along with you.
Let's do it. Let's grab that sword and that torch and just go for it.
I want a Q-tip first.
Yeah. Clean it up a little bit. So one tip that you and I like to do, or at least I like to do, I think you're with me on this.
This is a tip? Or is this
is a tip.
Okay.
Well, this is the general tip of kind of getting started when you're mixing.
Gotcha.
And that is to, if possible, consolidate all your lead vocals onto one track.
That might be a style for you.
When it's possible, yes, I like to do that because I like to have a nice long track of there's my lead vocal.
Right.
Now, there are a couple of boundaries on that, why I would not do that. And that would be, let's say that you have a vocal line that rings out when the next line comes in. So you don't have that overlap.
Yeah,
but if it's just
overlap.
one, right, overlap or underlap or showing with my hands here.
Something lap. And you'll have to watch the video for that one.
Yeah, it's going to be worth it. So if I have whether decent enough gaps in between vocal lines, I like to put everything on one track just for the ease of processing. And for me, it just helps get like a better overview of what the lead vocal is doing.
Sure, I get that. It's the concept of lead vocal on one track.
Yeah, I like that.
Good.
When it's possible. So when I say when that's possible, besides the overlapping line syndrome there,
Sure.
right, that we might have, another thing would be if there are drastically different vocal techniques. Let's say that you have a verse that's full of proximity effect and you're really, really up close and you got a lot of low end and this and that. And
It's
you
very, very intimate.
Yes. Just like now we're whispering in your ear and it's kind of gross and creepy. So let's say that you have an intimate kind of warm, soulful vocal, and then you get more of like an opening up and not necessarily a screamy, but a lot more projection in the chorus. Then I'm probably going to want to treat those two differently. I might need more compression on the vocal or something to even out dynamics or something. And if that's the kind of vocal, I'm not going to place them on the same track.
Gotcha.
So-
Yeah, that makes sense.
Do you like to keep things kind of separate when you do your vocal mixing, or how? I know we have to say here it's all program dependent, right? Cheers.
Drink up.
Yeah,
Shot time.
it does obviously depend on what the song is like. But whenever possible, I like to have
Lead
My
vocals on
lead
one track,
vocal.
yeah.
Yeah.
The idea
Yeah.
of consolidating and managing your mix by using less tracks. It makes good sense. I don't disagree with it.
Yeah.
But a lot of the time, it depends, again, program dependent. If it's
Yeah.
a rock song, chances are I'm probably using a single lead vocal track for the entire thing. Chances are. If it's
Right.
a pop track, chances are it's not going to happen that way. If it's a folk singer-songwriter track, chances are it's one lead vocal through the whole thing kind of thing. So
Right.
it is program dependent, and it also depends on how many vocals I've got and what kind of layers are happening. It's dependent on a lot of things, but we're talking about mixing lead vocals, and generally speaking, you try to consolidate for the ease of managing your mix, getting all of your leads onto a single track.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, it's like you said, they're managing the mix, right?
Yes.
And so even if you have, let's say you mentioned a singer-songwriter kind of thing, you might not end up with 100 tracks.
No.
But it's still
One would
the
hope.
idea of having a manageable number and just the less things that you have to worry about when it comes to the mixing stage. I'm a fan of that.
Yes, yes, yes. So one of the things that helps though, when you get to the point where you've done all these different takes, and you've kind of hinted at it a little bit, is when you have things that are of varying volume levels, and I'm doing the same thing you were doing earlier. I'm using my hands. Must watch video. We're doing all
Right.
this hand shit. It has a lot to do with getting the gain stages between sections appropriate for each other if you're going to consolidate them down to one track so that things are
Absolutely.
not ridiculously drastically out. Like you don't have a vocal that's in the verse that's like super quiet and you can barely hear it. And then you got a pre-chorus that's coming up into a moderate level. And then a chorus it's like really goddamn loud and it's like, holy shit. So yeah, you want to make sure you get the gain stages between all those relatively similar in terms of like what's going on so that your instruments that you use to mold that thing into shape don't go haywire in between sections.
Absolutely agree. Yeah. Yeah. And then, that if you're using it, chances are you're going to be using some kind of compression on on the vocal track. So you're making the compressor work less hard if you have that, if you have more or less like an even level. And so you can do that with clip gains. You just bring it up and down. Having that, you can do it with automation. Automation, I like to leave to a later stage when I do that.
Sure.
Because to bring out certain words. So, but
And I think to
have,
clarify about clip gain, you're referring to the regions in an arrangement on a DAW, not like actually clip gain as in like
Yes.
gaining the volume to clipping.
Yes. Absolutely. Yeah. So I would, where Logic use, I think that the term is actually clip gain in
Isn't it
in the
region
Pro Tool-
gain? Or is it clip gain in Pro Tools? I don't
in
know.
Pro Tools, I think. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But we're talking about the same thing where you have like your little snippet of audio and you make sure that that is more or less of an equal level to the region prior.
Right.
So-
And another thing we should probably clarify about volume between different regions or clips in the arrangement is normalizing a piece of audio, which is the process of like taking everything so that whatever's the loudest in that particular region goes to zero. Not the right idea.
No.
No, bad idea. Use your ear, not your meters, and no normalizing. Normalizing is a bad idea when it comes to getting your volume levels to be the same.
Yeah. Because
Just saying.
Because you're dealing with the actual peaks, and they have very little to do with the average level of said audio. So,
Correctamundo.
yeah. So balancing that, and also don't fall for the temptation as well of when you're doing this adjustment, just looking at the waveforms, because that might not necessarily. I mean, you can use it as a gauge, but use your ear. Because something looks like it should be at the same level, it doesn't mean that it is.
No.
So use your ear
Yes.
and get it as balanced as you can. Now that doesn't mean that in the final mix everything is going to be at the same level, obviously.
No.
But at your starting point and your processing will be a lot easier to deal with that, especially if you're on one single track.
Yeah, I can concur with that statement.
Yeah. So
So
now
let's
we
move
got
on to
our
some processing.
we got our whole track put together,
Consolidated.
consolidated more or less at an even level.
Yeah.
So what step is next for Mr. Whitesides?
Well, I'm running a channel strip of obviously the processing that's going to be happening on there. There's a couple of different ways that you can approach getting a vocal massaged into place in a mix. One of them is to do all the processing on the channel strip itself, which is somewhat of something that I do. And then another one is to use parallel processing, where you
Right?
send things out to buses and they come back on trains or something of that nature.
Yeah, throwing all the technical terms here, right?
That's right.
No, but that's true. So the type of processing that we have inline on the channel, we're generally talking compression and EQ, that type of thing,
Yeah.
right?
Or if you've
Eh,
got some specialized software like console emulations, maybe you're using a particular console's EQ and compression.
Right. Yeah. Console emulation. Like if your case, you're a UAD guy, you might have that. I tend to use the Slate stuff.
Yep.
So
Yep.
there's that kind of processing where you're treating the audio as a chunk and it's not just going out to a send and doing that.
Right.
So what is your preferred order? I mean, there's people discuss all the time, like, is it EQ before compression? Is it EQ after compression? What do you like to do generally?
Here comes that phrase again. Program dependent.
Right?
It kind of depends. It actually doesn't even kind of depend. It really depends upon the source of the audio. If something is like super brittle and bright on the top end, I'm probably going to EQ that prior to hitting the compressor.
Right?
If something is super bassy, same story, probably going to do some EQing on it prior to hitting the compressor. But if something is generally very well recorded and everything's pretty much where it should be, compressor goes first, EQ goes second. That's generally how I will do it. Actually, it's not even general. That's pretty much how I do it, just like that.
Yeah.
If something's
Right.
way out of whack, I fix it EQ wise prior to hitting the compressor. If it's not way out of whack, compressor goes first, EQ goes after.
So
And
can we
even
say
then, if I'm EQing first and then compressing because I'm trying to fix something, I'm still likely to EQ after I compress.
yeah, correct. I would agree with that. I think you can say a hard and fast rule, if you will, is that any kind of corrective EQ, getting rid of, like you said, low end rumble or something like that, or just annoying frequencies, right? That
Yep.
might have been a bad mic choice or something, and you need
Something
to
like,
get rid of. Yeah, you might want to correct that before you hit the compressor, and then you might sweeten stuff after the compressor if you
yeah.
need to.
Yeah.
So
And that's
the
just
kind of-
directly right on the channel strip right there.
correct. Yeah, because you want to correct the entire signal with that. And one thing that we should note here as well is I think it's really important, and it took me a minute to wrap my head around this or get it into my head. Don't mix any instrument in solo mode unless you're like correcting little issues. When you're mixing, it's sort of like final levels and sweetening EQ, that kind of thing. Do it in the context of the mix.
Well, you
So-
just jumped a whole lot of steps right there.
Well, I thought that actually is because we're talking about correcting stuff,
Sure.
and we'll probably come back to it again and repeat that type of idea. But
Because it's important.
it is very important. Because then when you bring it back into the mix, like, ooh, what happened to my vocal? It sounded awesome.
Well, by
itself.
itself. And then all
Or
of a sudden it's in the
whatever
context of
instrument,
this.
right? The same thing goes for that.
Yeah,
But so another thing we should probably bring up as well. We talked about getting the levels even or kind of where you wanted using raising the level of the region or just clip gaining. We'll call it that. We'll use a Pro Tools word for right now.
Okay.
But it's also important to not let a compressor just handle the duty of leveling everything out.
Well,
You might want to use level or audio automation to kind of do that. I
damn
know.
it! Now I don't know what to do. I'm just
I know
kidding.
it would be so much easier. I'll just slap a compressor on it and let that mix itself.
It's what the LA2A does.
The mix
Just
itself
kidding.
plugin. Yeah. But no, so don't think of or try not to think or resist the temptation of thinking that just putting a compressor on it, you won't have to do any
What about
audio
a limiter?
automation. Same thing there. If you want to squeeze all the life out of your audio track that the vocalists try to do, and just, let's do that. Just limit everything and it's going to be loud and awesome, right? No.
Because loud is so cool.
Yeah, because people don't have volume knobs on their units that they're listening to.
That's right.
I'm sorry, my old fart is showing here again.
Your old fart. Better get some young fart coming in.
Right. But that's the processing of that. So now we've got, let's say that we have a beautiful sounding piece of audio with our compression and EQ.
Yeah.
Next step, what might we want to add?
Oh, some reverb or some delay or some slapback delay or flange or chorusing or vocal synth. Who knows? There's all kinds of things that could be thrown at something depending on what the vocalist and the band wants and what the mixing engineer can finagle.
It almost sounds like you're saying that this is program dependent, right?
Almost.
Yeah.
I mean, we're already like 3 shots in on that shit.
Yeah, it's
Need
going
to
to be
get
a long day
bottle
today,
of
huh?
Jack.
Yeah. No, but in all seriousness, there's, obviously it depends on what the song calls for in this case. But the two big ones that we tend to hear and use most of the time is reverb and delay.
Yes, sir.
And these are generally, not always, but generally are placed on ascend, right? Where
that would be parallel.
That would be parallel. So
another thing that you can do let's continue on the reverb and EQ thing, because there's another thing that you can do in parallel that we kind of skipped right over and we can add in.
What, do you want to go back into that and do that first?
Well, it has to do with actually, it's more of an effect issue than it is. So we'll just treat it as an additional effect after we get over this reverb and delay stuff.
Let's do that.
Yes.
So choosing delay and reverb, just do your favorite preset, right, and go for it. No. There are different types of reverb, obviously, and depending on the track, I think you should choose wisely, something that's going to work for that. It's very tempting, again, when you have you're listening to just a vocal and you have this nice long plate and it's gonna sound awesome, and then it gets washed out in the mix, right? So
yeah, and plate is a type of reverb for those that don't know.
Yes. So, but speaking of reverb, so what kind of reverb treatment do you generally go for?
Reverb
Let's say that
treatment?
you're doing your own music. You're doing more like a pop kind of track. So what do you tend to go with?
I go with multiple reverbs and sometimes multiple delays. In terms of what I'm doing, I'm usually using multiple reverbs and multiple delays a lot of the time.
Right. What kind of reverbs do you like to use?
Well, when I say multiple reverbs, generally speaking, I'm attempting to use 2 reverbs on a lead vocal, and one of them is a very short reverb to give kind of an immediate little presence around the space of the vocal. The second reverb is usually more of a tail thing, so that there's a little bit of a flutter on the back, not a flutter, but just a long trail that has a lot less to the girth of the sound, but more to just an ambient kind of feature, an air kind of thing. That's a general sense. And then I'll do the same thing with a delay. I'll use a very short delay, sometimes a slap that's in stereo and slightly differently timed so that it gives a little bit more space around that as well. and then a second delay that may be quite a bit longer that's tucked in and generally side chains so that when the lead vocal is doing something, you really don't hear the delay, but when it comes back out, it kind of just sneaks into the mix.
Right. Right.
Just
Now that,
adds a lot of character and depth.
yes. Now that's a cool trick actually, where you place a compressor on said delay return, and you actually have the vocal trigger that sidechain. So when the lead vocal is happening, the delay signal drops, and when you're not singing, that kind of sneaks back in. It's a very cool little tip.
Yes, sir.
But you said with your reverbs there, you said you have one more for a little bit more of an ambience type of thing.
Yep.
The initial one. And when you're saying ambience, what are you talking about as far as like reverb time, that kind of thing? We're talking less than a second now, right?
Yeah, it's generally very short. It's very quick. And generally contains more of the body of the sound. But again,
Right.
this is also program dependent, but it gets the vocal to sound spacious without sounding super intimate. Or I guess I reverse that. It sounds a little bit more intimate without being overly spacious, but gives it a good sense of where it is inside a room or a space for that matter in the mix. And that becomes dependent upon the tempo of the song and what the spatiality is of the rest of the instruments. So a lot of it comes down to what space am I trying to create for each instrument and how does it fit within everybody else's or with every other instrument's space, regardless of whether it's a vocal or a guitar.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very good point, because again, it can be very tempting to have these big lush rooms or halls or plates or anything like that, and it sounds great, but it just turns into this big soupy mess when you kind of got keyboards and guitars and stuff going on.
Not even a stew, a soupy mess.
A soupy mess, it all just swirling together.
That's right. And you wonder where the clarity and the intelligibility went in terms of your vocal.
Right.
You don't want to wonder that unless it's on purpose.
Yeah. And from my experience also, when you're talking about the ambient reverb, you can get away with just quite little of it actually, but it just does something to the vocal where if you listen to it and you go, oh, well, that I can't really pick up on it, but then if you take it out, it really loses that dimension. So just having something where you place it in a little bit of a space, and it could be, I have some IRs from Bricasti and things that I like to use for that one. It's just like an ambience kind of thing, but it could also be like a small wooden room or something like that. But don't be too aggressive with those return levels.
Or the send levels.
Or the sound
whichever way
levels.
you do it.
Yeah, however you blend it, right? So we're talking the next step then, I think that with the halls or possibly plates, that type of a thing, where you have a little bit more of the tail that you send that places it to a little bit bigger beauty fairy dust on top of the kind of vocal there, right?
I like that one. Fairy dust.
Yeah.
Sprinkly.
So when you're doing that, how careful are you with having the tails go in the tempo of the song? Is that something that you're generally concerned with, or is it just no, this just kind of feels good? It's going to be somewhat washed out anyway, so I don't care. Or is it, do you think, oh no, it's going to ring for 2 beats or a bar or something like that? Is that something that you're concerned about?
The concern part comes from more of the pre-delay for me. And I actually have a BPM chart that I refer to often depending on tempo of song and the division of the beat that I'm looking for in terms of the pre-delay. The tail end comes more from a feel factor. So if the tail is starting to be like so long that it's really smearing over the next vocal line, I'm probably going to reduce the length of that if it's not feeling right and it's starting to feel smeared. I guess is the best way to say it. Because I unless I really want something to be smeared, which is not very often, I have to be considerate of that.
Yeah. So that the pre-delay time, where do you normally place that? Of course, again, that's going to be dependent on the song and stuff. But
Well, that's
you
highly
gen-
dependent upon the tempo.
Right. Well,
Highly.
that of course, but that division, do you tend to do that as like a 32nd note, a 16th note, that type of thing?
It usually does not go over a 16th note, but most often it's a 32nd.
Yeah.
Sometimes
so
it's a 64th, but most often it's a 32nd.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Math.
And that just
All about
and
the
that-
math.
Right. And you know, what's the formula there? When you take 60 and divide it by the BPM of the song, and you get the millisecond for
Yes.
the delay. So, yeah. So
Well, I now have a chart. I just refer to the chart.
yeah.
What's my BPM? What's my division? Poof, oh, there it is.
Right.
Okay, I got to type in that number.
That is the formula anyway, right? You
Yeah.
have the 60 seconds per minute, and you divide that by the beat or the tempo of the song, and you get the millisecond as a result there. But okay, so
And it's the
now
same thing with the delays too. My delays are always tempo synced, and then I will fudge them a little bit by
Yeah.
a few, like not necessarily
Few
samples,
millisecond.
but like milliseconds to just kind of give the feel so that there's not just a rigid timing unless it recalls for rigid timing. But usually I don't like the vocals to be quite so rigid. So essentially I will fudge them, especially if they are stereo delays, so that they get just kind of a little bit of an offset. And again, I'm using my hands, so you would have to see this on video.
Jazz hands.
Jazz hands to just kind of get, because that gives that a little bit of a sense of space and movement when you do that.
Yeah. And I do the same thing actually, whether that's on vocal or might be a lead guitar or something like that.
But we're talking vocals here, so don't get out of that.
Yeah, don't get into guitars today, Chris. But a little bit goes a long way. So even if you do it like 5 or 10 milliseconds on each one.
Oh, I wouldn't even go that far.
I might. Yeah.
Well, there you go.
Yeah.
No, it depends. Again, it's dependent, but
right. Yeah. See how much and how wet that delay is. How
much is
prominent
coming
that is.
back? How much the feedback? How many
Yeah.
feedback or how many delays are coming back at you? Yeah, it's all.
Yeah, yeah. Another thing I want to bring up as well on as far as like the reverb, it's a trick usually referred to as the Abbey Road trick. I believe.
Oh no! What is Abbey Road and what's the trick? Tell us.
Well, Abbey Road is a famous studio in London.
No,
but,
you don't say.
Yeah.
I even saw an article about this morning that Paul McCartney would prefer to record at Abbey Road than in his bedroom, even though he loves Billie Eilish. I thought that was interesting, but
well, yeah. Yeah, but he has a bit of a track record at it.
Yeah, he sort of
Abbey
does.
Road. He's done some cool stuff there.
And they recorded in the middle of the night when they weren't bothered.
Right, and
it's
he's
kind of
Paul
like recording
McCartney,
in
so
your
he can
bedroom
do
in a sense.
whatever he wants, really.
Yeah, exactly.
So no, but the Abbey Road trick with regards to reverb is to have a shelf EQ cut pretty severely the high frequencies of the reverb as well as the low end.
So you're kind of just leaving the body is what you're saying.
Yeah. And
I did not know that this was known as the Abbey Road trick. It's just something I do anyway.
Yeah, but I think it's the probably comes from now. Somebody I'm sure will correct me on this if I'm wrong, but I think it comes from the engineers at Abbey Road that they used to do that. Or it could have been just that's how their reverbs worked at the time. But the effect is really, really cool. You can actually get away with a lot wetter of a signal.
Yeah.
Without it just getting super washed out. So you can go, it can go as low as, well, you can go as low as you want, but anything over like 3K, so on the high end, and, maybe 300 to 500 on the low end, but just season that to taste. But the idea of doing a cut or a shelf cut on the low and the high end on the reverb return.
And this is EQ This is EQ that happens after your reverb on your send. So it's on the same channel strip as your reverb. You put an EQ after the reverb to do this EQ move that you're talking about.
Correct. And I've even heard people experimenting with doing this cut before the reverb on the actual reverb track or the channel strip
Sure.
with the reverb, so that you're basically just not sending those frequencies. I tend to do it after the fact. So I send
Gotcha.
the whole signal to the reverb, and then I do the cutting after that.
Or if you're a Logic user and you have Space Designer, you can
Yep.
use Space Designer, and that has a built-in EQ right in it, which is
Yes.
pretty awesome.
Yeah. There are other reverb units that do that. Lustrous Plates has that as well. I think it's
Cool.
Liquisonics that do that. So
Altiverb,
yeah,
I think, Altiverb has that too.
yeah, don't be afraid of EQing your reverbs. Is it, very, very beneficial. So,
be afraid. Get a handle on it.
yeah, nobody's gonna die. It's gonna be fine. So
Now we've covered the reverbs, we've covered some delays, and by the same token on the reverbs and EQing them, delays, same story. You can
Sure.
actually do some more incredible stuff with delays by EQing them and removing high and low end. That gets them to sit better in the mix too, or gives them a spatial frequency that's separate from the lead vocal. So you can do
Yeah.
the same thing with your delays
yeah, and
Now-
there I tend to be a lot of times. I tend to be even more heavy-handed
on the
with,
delays.
especially where I would cut a little bit lower actually, because it can give you that vibe, and it has unless you're calling for a really sort of high-endy techie kind of sound with all the sparkle fairy dust, again I'll use that word, but you can get a little bit of a warmer kind of vibe out of your delay if
You
you
know-
end up cutting a lot out.
Here's what I'm thinking.
What are you thinking?
That's a really good 2-minute Tuesday tip right there. How you're going to EQ your delays on your returns.
There you go. Cool. Done. I'll make sure it happens.
Bingo, bango, boingo. All right.
Yeah.
So, in terms of this whole parallel and sending things to buses and stuff, one thing we didn't really mention was the concept of using yet another compressor
Yes.
in parallel. So, what I mean by that is you would do a send to a bus and have a compressor on it that's set kind of extreme, and then you feed that compressor the signal that then comes back really compressed, and you tuck that back into the lead vocal to give it more beef without giving it a ton more volume.
Yeah. And you still get the dynamics of the original performance.
Yes, you get the
kinda
dynamics.
It's here's your energizer send kind of thing.
Your energizers. And I believe that terminology is called New York compression.
Yes. And we're usually thinking about that in terms of drums. Like
Yes,
side
it's
chain
usually a drum
compression.
thing,
Yeah.
but it's a cool thing to do with vocals as well. Don't
Yeah.
always have to do it, but it is a cool thing to do.
Yeah. Yeah. And like I said, it can beef up that vocal a little bit just because you're just girthing it up a little bit, to quote your phrase. Or we'll add a little bit more girth to it.
A little more foundation, please.
Yes. So we talked about now one thing here we should bring up as well, and this is one of those things. It's no rules to this, obviously, but a lot of people talk about the sweet spot of compressors, generally compressors that are emulating
Hardware
pieces
units.
of hardware. Yeah.
Yes.
So it's now the thing that most people don't want to hear, and I certainly didn't want to hear, is usually, well, just use your ear, and if it sounds good, it is good, right?
Oh,
People like to
come
think,
on.
oh no, there's a right way you have to do this. It's going to be this, and everything is going to be all right with the world. But there are a couple of different ideas. I fairly recently saw Chris Lord-Alge do a mix online where let's say a certain classic plugin company have released emulations of the 1176 and the LA2A and also the LA3A. But those were modeled after Chris Lord-Alge's actual hardware units. So he knows those units inside and out.
One would
And
hope.
in this, Oh yeah, well, I'm pretty sure he does. He's also a guy, right? He's done some cool stuff. He should stick with it, and he can accomplish stuff, right? Um,
Right?
yeah,
He's got a
that's a
career going. He's
yeah,
definitely got something that could be a career.
right. That's a joke. Call me your horse. Um,
No
but
offense, Chris. We love you.
yes, absolutely. But this I thought was interesting because he said that he was using an 1176, the blue stripe, in this video. And he said that the default setting that comes up when you pull up that plugin, that's how he has that set in his rack. So
Yes. I did see
he
that.
said,
He did say
yeah,
that.
right. And he said, this is the sweet spot. And I like to get my lead vocal here to get about 3 to 4 dB of reduction. So instead of what you would normally do is increase the input or lower the input on an 1176 to get the desired reduction, he uses a plugin, or in this case, I think it was a Pro Tools session, he used clip gain to adjust that region's level to hit the sweet spot of the input of his 1176 emulation. I thought that was
Yes.
really, really interesting. I'd never approached it that way, but if you really want to nerd out, go for it. See
No,
if
that's
you
a
get
good way to
different
look at
result.
it. I'm
Yeah.
pretty sure that that's how most of the plugin manufacturers, they go, this is where the sweet spot of this unit is, and that's your default setting.
Right.
And if you're making adjustments beyond that, more power to you, but
Right.
pay
But-
attention to that stuff.
Yeah. So it's something now I wouldn't necessarily get super anal about that kind of stuff. So, oh, it has to be this, but it's worth a shot, right?
Yes.
You give it a try and you see, and you might get some surprisingly good results doing that. So that's just a little bit of a techie, nerdy side that I wanted to bring up when we're dealing with that. But jumping back ahead to space time effects here.
The space-time continuum.
Yes.
Where's my flux capacitor?
You broke it. Obviously, we're dealing with these on sends
Yes.
most of the time. And one of the things that we're talking about today here is having the lead vocal on one track. So that means that, let's say we had that dynamic sensual verse that we talked about before, right? You might want more reverb on that than you do in the chorus. Sometimes you might get away with just having the same level all the way through. You might, but here's, a chance where you might have to just automate that sense. So if you have everything on one vocal or on one
track in the arrangement.
well, that's easy for you to say.
It is.
You may have to just automate the sound levels to your wet effects there, but you're generally keeping the core of that audio with the compression and the EQ the same as you're going through there. So
so you're
automation.
saying get used to using some automation.
Absolutely.
Good,
Yeah,
good.
yeah,
Dig it.
yeah. I'm big fan of automation. Yeah.
Automation's a wonderful thing. So you don't have to dance around all the time. Because that
Right.
was one thing that Chris Lord-Alge and other mixer engineers required prior to the whole computer revolution. They'd have to remember every single move they did. And then that
Yeah.
was the one version of that mix. That was it. You weren't
Right.
recreating
Yeah.
that.
Before you could program the SSL and that kind of, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And on an A side to that, here's another super deep, nerdy thing here, but it was a Mutt Lange thing where, I think it was Mike Sheps, but it was one of his engineers anyway that they were talking about. I think they were doing a Shania Twain record at the time, where they asked, how do you get that super upfront vocal sound without it being super sibilant or just annoying? And he would tell the stories where they were actually sitting with parametric EQs in their lap during mixdown stage, and they would by hand automate certain syllables up and down to kind of ride that in a live mixdown situation.
I've done that. Not with a unit in my lap, but actually automating EQ moves.
Sure. Yeah. But they would actually do it in real time
Oh no,
to do that with hardware.
that's
That's
scary.
yeah, that's scary. Damn it, Chris, you screwed up the mix one more time. Do it from the top again, you know?
Right.
Yeah, so that's
Practice makes perfect.
yeah, and I mean that the tools that we have today
Make
makes
all that
job,
stuff very
yeah.
easy by comparison.
Yeah, so when we complain about the plugin can't do a certain thing, maybe we should think twice.
Exactly.
But anyway, so
That kind of covers it, right?
I think that kind of covers it. We talked about placing everything on one track, treating EQ.
Where you're
before,
putting
after
EQ
compression.
before and after compression. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sends for your effects,
Yeah. And
volume
well,
levels.
one thing that we haven't talked about, we'll just do this and wrap up after that. How much do you like to compress your vocal on the main track, so to speak? By how do you tend to, and you do this, we could nerd out just a little bit more. We got a couple of minutes here, but you like to place, and this is where I think you and I do it slightly differently, but I think you like to, your first go-to compressor is an LA2A, yes, on your vocal?
A lot of the time, yes.
Yeah.
And it's a very lovely compressor for vocals.
Yes. And how much do you tend to, again, I know this is program dependent, but
actually, you want an explanation?
Yes.
Is that what you're getting at? You want an explanation?
That's what I'm getting at. Please explain yourself.
All right. So many years ago in a galaxy far, far away, when I used to record everything as clean as possible with no compression and no EQ on the way in, I would compress the living snot out of it on the back end while mixing. And it always tended to sound kind of awful. So now I do, yeah, right. Imagine that. I want as a dynamic. I want it to be as close to the real source as it was when I recorded it. Bullshit. No, now I actually think about getting as close to the sound as I can prior to even tracking, so that once it goes from tracking to mixing, it becomes a lot easier to mix. So when I'm recording, I will use a compressor, and it won't be super heavy, but at the loudest points of the vocalist or whoever it is I'm recording, probably going to hit the needle no more than a -3.
Yeah.
Like moving the needle at a 3. So it's a 2 to 3 dB thing on the way in as I'm recording it. Nothing that's like super obvious when you're listening to it. Then in the mix stage, on my channel strip, I will have a compressor, and it will only be compressing about another 2, maybe 3 dB there. Then it goes to a bus for the vocal sub thing, and there's another compressor there doing about another 2 to 3 dB. So over the course of everything, it might be about 6 to 9 dB of compression, but it's been done in stages. Yeah, that is like literally 95% of the time that's how I'm working with compression on a vocal.
So beyond tracking now, when you have it on your lead vocal line, but do you go for another LA2A, or what do you tend to do?
Yes and no. It depends, again, on the song. So some songs I'll actually track and deal with everything using 1176s, which is more of a limiter than it is a compressor.
Well, it's certainly very, very fast attack.
Yeah, it's very fast attacks, and it's a little bit different. So it really becomes dependent upon the song of like, do I choose an LA2A? Do I choose an 1176? Do I choose a Fairchild? Do I choose something else? It is dependent upon the character that I want that suits the song. So there is no right or wrong answer, but generally if I'm using an 1176 vibe, I'm going to use different versions of the 1176 for different reasons, because there's one 1176 that only that has a 2 dB button. Most of them have 4 is their minimum.
4, 8, 12, and 20.
Yeah. So the other one I think is 2, 8, 12, and 20 or something like that. So I will use that one in conjunction with the others just for various reasons, so that I don't get as much compression or limiting out of it. Same thing with the LA2A. Various generations of the LA2A had different speeds to what they do. So I'll choose the slower speeds to start and usually end up with the faster speeds at the end of the chain, so to speak.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I tend to do the exact opposite.
Start with the faster ones and go to the slower?
Yes, because generally what my way of thinking is that with a vocal, if I'm doing anything up front, I want to just catch random peaks. So, but I would do the same thing, the same kind of idea where I might not even compress the entire vocal, right? It would just catch those highest peaks just to kind
Sure.
of even that out. And then at the next stage, I would use like an LA2A to kind of massage it even a little bit more so it kind of sits in that. But again, unless you're going for, like we said, the parallel effect or anything that where you might crush it as shit, right? But I would more often than not, just like you, 2 to 3 dB, 4 tops, just in stages, kind of going through to get a little bit more of a more transparent result, I suppose. And then obviously even before then, I would add vocal automation, just level automation, so it could hit even harder. Yeah. So there we go. I think we kind of ended that with part one. Next time,
part one is done.
Part two will be what we're talking about when we're not on the same vocal track.
That's right. When you have lead vocals on multiple tracks.
Yeah.
And why you do that.
And yeah, exactly. All right. That's going to do it for me then, Jody.
All right, Chris. That'll do it for me too.
Awesome. Well, thanks for listening.
We'll see you next week, or you'll hear us next week.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jody. Bye.